Our next presenter is Samuel King. Samuel is a second-year Master of Arts student in Religion and Ecology at Yale Divinity School and formerly served as a Fulbright Scholar in Sri Lanka. The title of Sam's presentation is Negotiating the Center and the Periphery, Conceptions of Nature in Early Chinese Poetry. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, and great to be with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. So my presentation is called Negotiating the Center and the Periphery, Conceptions of Nature in Early Chinese Poetry. And while my background is in South Asian studies, I became more interested in Chinese literature and poetry through a course I took this past fall, and particularly the ways in which Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian themes sort of animate these poetic works that I'll be discussing. So just moving to the next slide here. Let's see. Aha. Great. So in the pre-modern Chinese literature tradition, nature is often seen as a source of healing, inspiration, and transformation, particularly in the face of the fraught political realities of dynastic politics. Many of these poets that I'll discuss faced exile and were even executed, grappled with crippling poverty, and were very much grappling with this sort of fragile character of human life. And in studying in studying these various poets, I'd like to illuminate the varying conceptions of the ways in which nature is understood vis-a-vis culture. In other words, I was interested in the question, how do poets from the center and the periphery experience a sense of healing through the natural world? So I'm going to investigate this question through three of the seminal Chinese nature poets, Tao Chen, Xie Chao, and later Su Shi. Tao Chen is considered a consummate Chinese nature poet from the 4th to 5th century. He was a civil servant in the Chinese capital of Nanjing at the time during the turbulent Six Dynasties period, and became very disillusioned with the tumultuous realities of political life during his time. And he had this famous renunciation after 80 days where he returned to his rural home in modern day Jiangsu province, which became the inspiration for much of his poetry. Tao Chen's poetry is infused with this tension between his Confucian sense of duty up to civil service, to providing for his very poor family, as well as his Taoist sensibility toward finding a sense of communion with the changing seasons of nature. And in that sense, he was very much influenced by the works of the great Taoist Zhuangzi. His ascetic and utopian ideal is very much at play in his work, where he yearns for this sort of apolitical utopian community on the margins of empire, very much illustrated in a famous poem called The Peach Blossom Spring, in which he's able to experience a harmony with the changing seasons of nature. So I'd like to read a passage from Tao Chen's famous work, The Return, where he writes, "Back home again, may my friendships be broken off and my wanderings come to an end. The world and I shall have nothing more to do with one another. If I were again to go abroad, what should I seek? Here I enjoy honest conversation with my family and take pleasure in books and zither to dispel my worries. So little time are we granted human form in the world. Let us then follow the inclinations of the heart. Where would we go that we are so agitated? I have no desire for riches and no expectation of heaven. Rather on some fine morning to walk alone, now planting my staff to take up a hoe, or climbing the east hill and whistling long, or composing verses beside the clear stream. So I managed to accept my lot until the ultimate homecoming. Rejoicing in heaven's command, what is there to doubt? In this poem, you get a sense for Tao Chen's vivid, colorful imagery in his poetry, the ways in which he's striving to harmonize himself with the changing seasons of nature, and to come to terms with his own mortality in the wake of this existential and political crisis that drove him back into the countryside. Now, it's worth noting that Tao Chen's form of asceticism, the sense of place building that he cultivates, is not devoid of other humans. In another poem, he writes, I build my hut in a place where other people live, yet do not hear the noise of carts and horses. You ask, how can I do this? When the mind is detached, the place becomes remote of itself. I pick chrysanthemums by the eastern edge. Carefree and content, I see the southern hills. Here we see the ways in which perspective is what ultimately allows Tao Chen to experience a sense of serenity and a sense of spiritual communion with the rural domicile that he inhabits. Next, I'd like to discuss the great courtier poet Jie Chao, who lived slightly later in the 5th century during a time known as the Yang Ming era, which under the patronage of Emperor Wu was a time of artistic ingenuity, where great state sponsorship gave rise to the capital of Chiang Kang being not just a political capital, but a hub of artistic and literary production. In this way, Jie Chao represents an experience of the natural world from the center of political empire. Now, he was also embroiled in the precarious world of politics and executed at age 35. So in many ways, the natural world became a salve for the uncertain political realities that followed the Qi Liang dynasty, of which he was a part. We'll see in a moment that Jie Chao's poetry envisions nature as mediated by the palace itself. In this way, there's a melding of the artificial and the natural that collapses this boundary between nature and culture in pursuit of this Buddhist idea of shunyata, or an absolute and empty void undergirding reality. He writes, on this spring night, we take leave, pure wine in our goblets. I shall become a wanderer by the river's banks and marsh's edge. I can only sigh at the river flowing east. Imagine how fields have grown in my homeland. Crowded trees flourish day by day. Fragrant islets multiply in heaps. When I look down from the pavilion in Qingchao, I dream at night about returning home. Now, it's worth noting that this poem was written while he was following Prince Sui in a trip outside of the palace. And you can see this yearning to actually return back to the palatial empire. So very much different than Tao Chen, who yearned to escape the centers of political life. Jie Chao has this yearning to return to the palace and its garden environments. In that vein, he writes in another poem, I open the window, anticipating a clear and panoramic view. Rolling up the curtains, I await the beautiful sight. How grand it is. The sun casts its light on the streams as round clouds emerge from the peaks. High above, the magnolia rafters are steep. Joined together, the stone paths are straight. North of the pool, trees are afloat. Beyond the bamboo groves, the mountains loom like shadows. You can see in this poem the ways in which Jie Chao's poetry fuses the experience of windows as a prism to more fully inhabit the natural world around him, ultimately leading to this spiritual experience of shunyata, or emptiness, in the Buddhist tradition. Now, the later poet, Su Shi, I'd like to suggest is a bridge between this sort of ascetic sensibility of Tao Chen and this aristocratic sensibility of Jie Chao by writing from both the center and the periphery of political power. He was a prolific poet during the Song dynasty and a Confucian official who drew on a variety of interests, including mastering the perfections of poetry, painting, and calligraphy. In many ways, he emulated Tao Chen as another poor man who is beholden to his political commitments to make a living. He even considered himself an incarnation of Tao Chen. Like his forebears, he was also embroiled in factional politics and at various times of his life exiled and pardoned. And so his poetry reflects this shifting perspectives from the center and the periphery of political empire, in which he sought to cultivate a sense of peaceful stillness, this Taoist idea of harmonizing with the Tao, the eternal way that it unfolds throughout the life cycles. He writes, in the wake of being exiled to a remote part of China, he writes, "I live here between heaven and earth, alone and wandering a vast millstone. I struggle feebly on toward the right, but the wind wheel just hauls me left. I hurried along, all humanity and duty, and still wind up ice cold and hungry. Cooking rice on a sword blade is risky, and you can't sit on a rug full of pins. But rivers and mountains are exquisite, fleeting as an afternoon thunderstorm. And when young, who's daring enough to leave the world for a fieldland home? What luck to be sent here, abandoned, a horse liberated from saddle and bags. The family together, we've taken over a river post station in this far off place. Heaven open to us. Hunger and want come and go. Why celebrate or mourn? Pure repose, free of all sorrow and joy, I won't make a lament of my sad words." You see the way in which Su Shi finds a sense of reconciliation with place, re-inhabiting place after being exiled and losing his civic post. In this next poem, Su Shi is writing from a boat trip he takes in a place called Red Cliffs on the Yangtze River. And you see the ways in which shifting perspectives of the natural world allow him to experience a sense of reconciliation with both his own mortality and his own sort of precarious political life. In this poem, which is portrayed as a conversation with a friend, his friend says, "We ride on a boat no bigger than a leaf, as we drink to each other out of simple gourds. We exist no longer than mayflies between heaven and earth, and are of no more consequence than a kernel in the vast ocean. I grieve that my life is but a moment, and envy the long river's endless flow. If only I could grasp hold of a flying transcendent and wander with him through the heavens to embrace the bright moon and live forever. But I realize this cannot be attained, so I confide these lingering sounds to the sad autumn wind." I said, "Do you really understand the water and the moon? Here, it flows by yet never leaves us. Over there, it waxes and wanes without growing or shrinking. If you look at things as changing, then heaven and earth do not last for even the blink of an eye. If you look at them as unchanging, then I, along with everything, am eternal." In this powerful message, you see the ways in which Su Shi reconciles with nature through this shifting perspective. He consoles his friend by suggesting, if you see the world as changing, then you are also changing in this ephemeral passing of heaven and earth. But if you see things as unchanging, then I, along with everything else, am eternal. So in conclusion, I'd like to suggest that the shifting perspectives that are used by these authors from various vantage points illumine visions of nature from both the center and the periphery. For Tao Chen, nature is seen as an antidote to his thwarted and disillusioned political life, only experienced intimately on the margins of political empire. Whereas for Xie Chao, the palace in Changkang is the experience of the natural world itself through a kind of tamed wilderness. These authors also offer a sense of home that includes the more than human. Each of them is involved in placemaking that takes into account the living flora and fauna that make up the living world around them. And finally, I'd like to offer that these poets offer a vision of re-inhabiting place as a site of healing and transformation in the midst of crisis. Each of them was embroiled in in remarkable crises throughout their lives, and finding a deeper sense of spiritual communion, whether through Buddhist, Taoist, or Confucian sensibilities, was what ultimately allowed them to more fully inhabit the places that they found home throughout their lives. And I'd like to conclude by with a quote from Thomas Berry, who was very fond of Chinese poetry and who's very much influenced by Chinese poetry in being a progenitor of the field of religion and ecology. He writes, "It was immediately apparent that any damage or any loss of the outer world of nature was a loss to the inner world of the human. A desolate outer world immediately produces a desolate inner world. The loss of the primordial forest is a loss of the soul in the human, since the way to the sacred is through the place of our dwelling." Thank you very much. And lastly, I'd like to thank my professor, Kang-Yi Sun Chang, who's retiring this year after nearly 40 years of teaching at Yale. And so I'd like to offer my gratitude to her for inspiring this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam. I learned so much from that presentation. So again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand physically or with the reactions, or put something in the chat. I have an initial question while people are thinking about things. So a lot of these ideas seem to also kind of reflect some early American writers about wilderness and, feeling like they are purified by taking a walk in a park, or, then John Muir, like going to actual wilderness, and also different perspectives of like actual wilderness could be really terrifying for people, but a park feels like that's purifying nature for them. So thinking about the center and periphery. So I'm just wondering if you've seen, it's just interesting to think like the same things that American writers have experienced is also throughout history with these Chinese poets. And have you seen kind of a parallel there?
Yeah, I definitely have. And it's a great question. And I think particularly English garden poetry resonates with the sort of courtier poetry of somebody like Jay Chou, who is finding a sense of spiritual communion with a kind of tamed wilderness, and almost seeing the garden environment as elevated above a sort of an unkempt wild forest, for instance. And then, certainly I would say some of the American transcendentalists in finding experience of the sublime in wilderness settings, I would say very much resonates with some of the ascetic poems of the Chinese literary tradition that you find in folks like Tao Chen, also other authors like Han Shan, who is a Buddhist renunciant, who's very popular actually in the 1960s in some of the countercultural movement in the United States, because Han Shan lived on a remote mountain in China and sort of disparaged culture and sort of the trappings of the world. So yeah, I have definitely seen a lot of interesting sort of cross-cultural literary affinities with some of this tension of, what is the relationship between nature and culture?
Sam?
So maybe along those lines, nature and culture, one of the points that you made was the palace as sort of microcosm, if I understood correctly. So I'm wondering like what maybe there is to learn from these poets about the relationship between the built environment and our ecological selves. Do you see any sort of important threads running through that we might learn from?
Yeah, absolutely. And while I would argue that the second poet, Jay Chou, sees sort of an ascetic rural life that Tao Chen inhabit, for instance, is somehow inferior to the palace. He does offer an interesting way of melding the human constructions with natural constructions and sort of complicating this binary between nature and culture, because for Jay Chou, a palace itself is a way of experiencing nature in and of itself. So while he was sometimes uh, uh, looking at the natural world from this elevated pedestal, I think that message that nature is here, wherever, in whatever place we inhabit, is a quite powerful one that can sometimes be missed when we simply, separate the cities as somehow separate from the natural world that's somehow out there. So thanks for your question, Sam, and great name, by the way.
No, thank you. You as well. Yeah, that actually kind of connects to a good deal of the literature on agoraphobia, particularly some of the historical literature, was looking. So agoraphobia, when it was first sort of coined in the late 19th century by a German psychiatrist whose name escapes me, it was conceived as like fear of open spaces. I mean, the agora in both senses, right? The market and open spaces. And it was basically thought of as like a woman's disease, the weak constitution of women in cities. That was obviously an extremely layered, problematic psychological conception, but like the architecture of cities was seen to be sort of devastating to the female psyche. The sort of bruteness of it, the depersonalization of architecture, the crowdedness, the dirtiness, it was seen to be sort of like opposed to the sort of natural feminine connection with the earth, which the fact that that is made feminine and then feminine is then subjugated is a whole thread that I would like to explore eventually in the psychological literature. But some of these questions about the built environment as being separate from or distinct from, and you talked about cities being distinct from the natural world, I think is a really important point and something that we need to reconfigure in our minds, that the city is not like the end of the natural world. The city is within the natural world.
May I ask a question about that concept, actually? I really enjoyed your presentation, Sam, and also Sam, but I'm sort of like riffing on this idea of cities and natural world. And I don't have experience of living in very many American cities, but I know that American cities in particular are very paved, very like high-rise central. So there's a real lack of light down at street level. They're not very green typically. And that's going to be very different from ancient cities in general. So like modern versus ancient, but I'm just wondering, like, how can you translate this idea of the natural world being still accessible from a city when it is such a concrete jungle instead of a place where green and flower and, you know, sort of the earth is accessible?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Emily. I don't purport to have any answer that, easy answer to that question. I often, what does it look like to live to re-enchant an urban environment or a city? I think, Professor Copeland's remarks are relevant here from earlier today. I mean, simple practices like cultivating a garden, an urban garden, trying to bring some kind of greenery to our cities. And I guess this is also where I would invoke, folks like Thomas Berry as seeing the particular always within the universal, and seeing, Thomas Berry was very much influenced by Confucian ideas of the human being embedded in the earth and the cosmos in the series of concentric circles. And so I guess having that idea of a macro identity that is that is always present even within your sort of micro identity within an urban environment or particular context, I think can help create this larger sense of ecological connection, even from a sort of what you could say a dilapidated city environment. But I understand it's a challenge, and I don't purport to have any easy answer to that question. Yeah, I don't know if other Sam, you want to add anything in response to Emily's great question?
No, I think that's good. The universal in particular, I find intriguing and something that I want to think further about. Relating that, I think that kind of relates to, who was it? At what point was somebody talking about permaculture? Was that in my last session? That must have been my last session. I'm sorry, I have a newborn. I don't remember when anything happened in the last 6 weeks. I think in the previous session, somebody was talking about permaculture, which makes me sort of think about cities and nature and wild, and constructing our cities in ways that reflect natural patterns, life-giving patterns, rather than that keep them out or block them out or function as at their exclusion.
I think something, just to sort of put a concrete example out there, something that was coming to my mind during Sam King, your presentation, was the Chinese garden in Portland, Oregon, which is in the middle of the Pearl District, which is on the side of the city, which is actually, it was industrial, and it's been converted, the warehouses have been converted over to like kind of fancy apartments, but also it's the high-rise section of the city. But in the middle of this high-rise section and formerly industrial section, they took one city block and converted it into a garden in the style of, I was told, ancient Chinese garden, with a tea house and with different paths and stonework that was meant to stimulate parts of your feet in order to do like sort of not acupuncture, but like pressure point massage. It's this very intricate and physical, like, and I'm not getting the right word here, but there's all kinds of sort of physical stimuli that they incorporated into the garden to connect people just in this one city block with all kinds of natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
Tactile, good.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Emily. Thanks for sharing that. I'm not familiar with that particular garden, but I like this idea of sort of, yeah, the continuity of the human and the earth, and that you know, that some of these poets illumine is that you know, nature does not need to be experienced only as this sort of wild place out in the sort of aesthetic periphery, but can be experienced through, you know, gardens, through what in the Buddhist understand this idea of expedient means, that there are different ways of reaching people at different points in where they are on sort of this path toward enlightenment. And I think that this idea of having urban gardens is an interesting way of reaching people in cities through, you know, broadening into this sort of ecological self, as you were saying, Sam, without needing to go to a national park or need to, you know, what's formerly considered a wilderness setting.
Great, thank you so much. I have one last question for Sam King. So I'm wondering about, are these poets used by modern like Chinese poets, or are they kind of used by like a modern environmental movement? Are they, or are kind of Chinese poets coming up with their own kind of environmental or natural, you know, movement as of today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say Tao Chen is probably the most famous Chinese nature poet. Although Professor Chang has remarked on how a lot of modern Chinese poets are not necessarily drawing so much on these poems for sort of ecological consciousness. So it's very much, I would say, like an emergent opportunity to look deeply within sort of the ancient Chinese tradition sort of reanimate some of these environmental movements. In her approximation, it's sort of nascent, but a great opportunity. I think within their particular context, nature was often used as a salve for existential, and political sort of challenges. But I think within from a modern perspective, these visions offer a really powerful way of both sort of coping with the isolation and loneliness we find, in an experience like COVID, but also in living in simplicity, living with a deeper awareness of our surroundings as a way of confronting the climate crisis and the need to, vastly reduce a consumptive lifestyle. So I think it's an amazing opportunity.